Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Corey Wells, Associate Director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and a co-director with my colleague Henry Hale of our policy program, PONARS Eurasia. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for a talk on EU-Ukraine relations and EU-Russia relations. Particular, we'll be focusing on the question of the future of the EU's sanctions policy toward Russia. As you probably remember, if thinking back to the start of the conflict, there was a significant question as to how serious the EU would be with regard towards its sanction policy on Russia in response to the Russian intervention in Ukraine. It unfortunately perhaps took the tragic downing of the MH17 flight for European sanctions to more seriously kick in. That said, we've now entered into an unusual situation in which we're facing a referendum tomorrow in the Netherlands, a referendum that has been put forward by opponents of the Ukraine's association agreement with the European Union, and it's been a rather unusual referendum, both in terms of the fact that these kinds of votes aren't taken for something as prosaic as free trade agreements usually, and also the fact that the Dutch themselves lost so many citizens in the downing of the plane. So we have many questions about the future of the policy, the significance of the referendum, where the EU policy towards Russia is going, where EU policy towards Ukraine is going, and we can really have no one better to discuss these issues than my good friend and colleague, Arkady Moshes of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and currently a short-term visiting scholar here at IRIS. Dr. Moshes is Program Director for the EU Eastern Neighborhood and Russia Research Program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and was an associate member of the Russian Eurasia Program at Chatham House until 2015. His areas of expertise include Russian-European relations, as well as domestic and foreign policies of Ukraine and Belarus. He's a very prolific author and a frequent media commentator. He's the co-editor of Russia as a Network State, What Works in Russia When State Institutions Do Not, and the co-author of a report on how sustainable is separatism in eastern Ukraine, and he's contributed articles to many books and academic journals. He's also a very invigorating speaker. We're honored to have him here. I'll turn the floor over to you, Arkady. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Corey, and let me start by thanking the Institute for actually having me here for a month. Unfortunately, it's coming to an end, and as every good thing, but it's been a pleasure, and in particular for arranging this talk. It's very important for me to have an opportunity to share my thoughts with people here. So let me thank all of you for coming. And I believe that actually what I'm going to talk about has been published already, so I think you expected some value added, and it's very rewarding for me to see so many people. As what I will be talking about is not so much maybe, or not only the future of sanctions, because I cannot offer you, I don't have a crystal ball, I cannot offer you a prediction if and when sanctions will be lifted or eased. But I will be arguing that unfortunately, due to a number of reasons, we can now argue that it is likely that Europe's involvement in Ukraine and commitment to Ukraine will be going down, and this is unfortunate. And this is because of kind of not yet the final sentence, but I find it likely. And the Dutch referendum, which Corey has just mentioned, is a very important indicator. We know that the Dutch referendum is not about Ukraine. It's about certain attitudes, and it's about Euroscepticism in a number of EU member states, primarily, and it's about certain Dutch domestic features, let me put it that way. But it's not accidental that, it is accidental that Ukraine just got there. but it's also not accidental, because more or less identical treaties with Moldova and Georgia are not subject to any referendum in the same Netherlands as they could be, because this is not considered to be an issue which the Eurosceptics believe they could win. And Ukraine, unfortunately, is. Therefore, we are facing a very dramatic, a pivotal moment. So all the hopes of Ukraine friends are that there will be low participation, so that it will not, whatever the results will be, they will not be binding in any way. I mean, the referendum is not legally binding. It's a consultative referendum. But basically, the empirical understanding shows that if 50% comes and takes part, and then 60% votes against out of that 50, so 30% of the country will be against the association agreement with Ukraine, Ukraine will be in trouble. Because I don't think that if such numbers vote against, the Dutch government will be able to ignore it. And what's going to happen, frankly, nobody knows. Because EU, or the EU institutions rather, on behalf of the whole Union, took very strict legal commitments before Ukraine. So I don't think that you can renegotiate it and launch the whole procedure of, amending the treaty, ratifying it in all the national state parliaments and European Parliament again. This is basically a non-starter. It might still be implemented, but nobody else but the head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, already 3 months back, said that if the no vote happens, it will produce a big crisis for the whole EU. And we just need to be very well aware of this. So I will talk about, indeed, Europe and Russia and Ukraine, some other things, and what's going on as regards this whole portfolio. But I will start by actually emphasizing the level of solidarity that Europe has demonstrated as regards Ukraine. I don't know if it's unprecedented, but maybe it is, or it's somewhere very close. If we talk about a country which is not an EU member, which is not even a candidate, in which, in all likelihood, is not going to become a candidate state in the next 2 decades. Over the last couple of years, Europe has done a lot. Sanctions on Russia and worsening of relations with Russia, as such, I mean, this is a major component of that, but this is not the only one. The sanctions. Entry into force of the same DCFTA, the association agreement, and the agreement on deep and comprehensive free trade are an achievement in their own right. Because Moscow did a lot to make this impossible, offering both carrots and sticks. The EU decided to go forward. And this was not, a conclusion that could be taken for granted 2 years ago. Europe has basically, with some caveats, but taken care of Ukraine's energy security as far as gas is concerned. Because the fact that Ukraine now imports so little gas directly from Russia, at the moment it doesn't import anything, and it imports a lot more gas, which is Russian in origin, but nevertheless, legally it's a different story, through Europe and through the system of reverse supply. This is an achievement. Again, this was not a foregone conclusion even a year and a half ago. And there were some EU member states which were very reluctant to take part in this whole new scheme. But now it's a fact. And last year, Ukraine imported 6 billion cubic meters of gas from Russia and almost 11 from Europe. And this is a country which several years ago was importing well over 40 billion cubic meters of gas from Russia, and before the 2008 crisis, 55 billion cubic meters of gas. And that required investment, that not only required political will, that required the creation of physical infrastructure. And that was done. The other thing is that the visa liberalization process is going on, and actually when visas will be abolished for Ukrainian citizens in Europe, it now totally depends on Ukraine. If Ukraine does what it has to do, which is again, I worked, it was 8 years ago, I did a major study on the visa freedom potential visa freedom in Russian-European relations. And then my interviews were showing, there were different people that I talked to, but those who were, anyway, let's say the attitude towards this perspective in relations with Russia was mixed. But this attitude towards the visa freedom in relationship with Ukraine was universally negative. Nobody in Europe I spoke to 8 years ago was talking about the visa freedom in relations with Ukraine. Now, it could potentially become reality 3 months from now, but I guess procrastination inside Ukraine with certain important things will now postpone it. But anyway, we have to see that Europe has done a lot. You add money, you add technical assistance, you add lots of things. But I feel that we've reached the point where the pendulum is about to start swinging back, or maybe has already started. And there's less interest, and there's less commitment already. The Russia sanctions, it's a symbol again. This is not a thing in itself, but we have certain things that happened here as well. For instance, the sanctions, and I'm now primarily talking about the most serious set of sanctions, which were imposed by the EU on Russia after the tragedy with the Malaysian Boeing in August 2014. They were extended several times. They are formally linked to the implementation of the Minsk process. But if in June last year they were extended by default, automatically, in December 2015, Italy requested a debate, which in the EU jargon is a no small thing, because this is an expression of a certain political position. The sanctions were still extended, but again, the public position taken, especially by Italy, was that nobody should expect, once again, just an automatic extension them 6 months down the road. And there are some other things as well. So my concern is that Ukraine has already started to lose the solidarity and even the sympathy within Europe that it has had and that it has been counting on having also in future. In other words, I'll come to that later, Ukraine fatigue is there and Ukraine is facing a risk. And why this is happening can be understood if we look at 3 sets of issues. One is related with Europe's policy towards Russia, relationship with Russia, the views of what is right and wrong in relationship with Russia. And we have to understand that in the last year or so, the dynamics and the changes were significant. 2014 was a shock for Europeans, no less than that. The annexation of Crimea, the war in Donbass, that was something which Europeans were not prepared to see or to tackle. But by now, I mean, this shock looks a lot weaker. It has subsided for a number of reasons. One reason is that NATO actually has woken up, and it is taking measures. I don't know if these measures are sufficient to make sure the security of all European allies of NATO, but at least it's demonstrating enough that if somebody else now invades, for instance, the Baltic states, there will be also a military price that will have to be paid. And this is more serious than what was there before. And there are trends in the military political developments of Europe which are, let's say, which alleviate some of EU member states' concerns about their security. The economic crisis is also there, which opens the debate about for how long and to what extent Russia can keep building up its defense capabilities. And even inside Ukraine, the Novorossiya project, which was part of the shock, in 2014, it collapsed. I mean, nobody's talking about Novorossiya project. Even inside Russia, there was a thing, correct me if I'm wrong, which was called the Parliament of Novorossiya. Even that place was kind of disbanded, no longer supported. I don't think they even still have a website. So Moscow is doing things differently. It doesn't mean it has abandoned its objectives as regards Ukraine. But for the Europeans, this looks like, signs of certain weakness of Russia's inability to threaten the whole Europe. This is what I mean. And in other words, Russia does not look like an existential threat, the way the Soviet Union used to be. And if it's not an existential threat, then deterrence and containment is not the only option that you can talk about. You have to be talking about other things. We have an ongoing discussion. It's going on in this country as well, but it's very active in Europe. The discussion about the motivation of Russia's actions, whether Russia did it out of strength or out of weakness, whether it was provoked, whether it was a victim of Western expansionism. And this is a big thing. I mean, here you have realists like Mearsheimer who do it. But in Europe you have a lot of people, especially the left professors, like to continue that discourse. That Russia is a victim of Western expansionism. And if it is a victim of Western expansionism, then you don't provoke it, and you should not be afraid. And as a result of that, Ukraine is clearly losing its centrality. I mean, because if you have a geopolitical debate within which Russia could be considered an existential threat, which would have to be deterred, then what you have to do is create Ukraine, your bulwark, the fortress. You have to boost its defenses. You have to help it. If Russia is not a threat, if all that Russia can do is to help some people to run 3% of Ukraine's territory of its behalf, and that's the end of the story, then you don't want to spend all this money and all the political capital on backing up Ukraine. Meanwhile, there's a debate about, or not a debate, but what we call the "we need Russia" mentality. And the "we need Russia" mentality is very strong. And every time something happens in the Middle East, you get the whole bunch of people in a number of EU member states, especially the big states, with the exception of Britain, who will be saying, okay, now it's the moment. Because without Russia we cannot fix this, without Russia we cannot fix that. And these people basically, they don't say it openly, but this is what they think, that there has to be a deal. That in order to secure the cooperation with Russia in the Middle East, you have to give to Russia something that it wants, and Ukraine can be one item. So In the geopolitical sense, Ukraine is no longer central to the extent it was 2 years ago. In the economic sense, I wouldn't call it Russia first approach 100%, but again, objectively, Russia is a lot more important. So if you have to choose between Russia and Ukraine, a lot of businesses choose Russia. We had a couple of Russia still can offer real money. Russia can offer investment. We've got 2 cases last year. One of them is kind of undecided, but again, the willingness is characteristic. I'm talking about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. 5 or 6 European energy majors signed well, it's not a contract, but again, signed an agreement with Russia that they would like to build it. Don't they know it will be done against Ukraine's interests? I mean, they're serious people. Of course they realize that. Yet they do it, because probably if the construction starts, it will make economic sense for a number of European energy majors. It will make sense for some countries like Italy, for instance, which you might think technically suffers because it would theoretically have to be against the increase of the flow in the north as opposed to south of Europe. But after, making some noise, it agrees because its companies will participate in the construction, because it does have technological capacity to do it. And quite a number of European politicians, and in that context, the German politicians matter primarily. They start the old mantra that this is a commercial project, that there is no geopolitics behind. And even Madame Merkel, who is otherwise doing all the right things, adheres to this mantra that this is fully commercial. So that's done. I mean, if you look at that's not done, sorry, but I mean, this is attempted, and that means people do not take into account geopolitical consequences for Ukraine. They care about big business deals with Russia. Another example is the nuclear power plant contract which Finland signed. And I don't want to go into details, even though I could, but Russia is going to invest. We are talking about several $billion investment, which would be made by Russia in Finland. And by the way, we keep talking about Russia as if the country were approaching its economic collapse. In reality, it has a lot of money. Several $1 billion investment for Russia is not a big deal. And this is attractive. You don't need to coerce your European business partners too much. Ukraine cannot offer anything like that. And so if you're facing choices, many choose Russia. A number of businesses are suffering from sanctions. Here I must admit that we should not generalize, and there is really no correlation between the actual negative economic impact and the political positions. I mean, the country which suffers from Russian counter-sanctions most is Lithuania. But of course, you will not hear many Lithuanians speaking in favor of reciprocal lifting of the sanctions. But you do see the impact. I mean, the German export to Russia, which in 2013 used to be $38 billion, or euros probably, in 2015, 2 years later, was only 20. So halved within 2 years. That's significant. If you look at the share, it was 3.2% of all Germans' exports in 2013, and it's less than 2% last year, 1.8 to be precise. And this is going on universally. Russia has just, the other day it was announced, it lost the position of the third trading partner of the EU. It's now that position is now held by Switzerland. Russia is still the fourth, but it used to be the third, and it was comfortably unchallenged third. Some of the countries have been able to reorient their exports. I know that in Finland, for instance, what used to be cheese sold to Russia is now milk powder sold to China. It's actually cheaper, but it goes against the ethos of the producers to a certain extent. But it's not such a problem in absolute terms, but nevertheless, it's there. There are important groups of lobbyists. The Eastern Committee of the German economy is the most important one, which clearly lobbies for the repeal of the sanctions. Again, as I said, it's not universal. It's not universal even inside Germany. If you read a paper of Hannes Adomait, I don't remember the title, but it's a very recent paper published by the Transatlantic Academy. He argues in the paper that people should pay attention to the position of other business organizations in Germany and the general, acquiescence or even support to the sanctions. But nevertheless, I mean, this work is going on. You hear this discourse that it's not a good idea to have these mutual sanctions. And we also have to remember that from day one, EU was very reluctant to do the sanctions. The Crimean sanctions were absolutely meaningless. I mean, they were notional, and without the Boeing, we would not have been, in terms of sanctions, where we are. Twice, after the escalation of August-September 2014, and then January-February 2015, when nobody in Europe was even willing to deny the Russian direct interference, the sanctions were nevertheless not raised. So when we're speaking about the sanctions, we are at the level of July 2014, even though the political context changed. Public opinion in Europe, which is still generally supportive of the sanctions, it's not supportive of the increased sanctions. The only thing which actually changed after the escalation of January, February 2015 was that the sanctions are now formally linked with the implementation of Minsk II. But this is a trick, and this is, I think, it's an uninformed guess. But I think this was a psychological reaction by some politicians, European politicians, because they knew they were cheated in Minsk. They knew they had agreed to something which was not obvious, but they thought they had a word of the other side that from now on the deal would be respected. And it wasn't. It was violated immediately with the takeover of Debaltseve. So I think they wanted to just get for themselves some kind of guarantees which would also boost intra-EU solidarity. And this is why the implementation of the sanctions is linked. So the sanctions are linked to the full implementation of Minsk Agreement, but procedurally, legally, this matters very much for the European Union. But the problem is that whatever we think, procedurally, it's done in a peculiar way, because you need a consensus to extend them every time. And if there is no consensus, they automatically expire. It's not that you need a consensus to lift them. It's that you need a consensus to extend them. And this is difficult because, of course, a single country in the EU will not veto them. I mean, this is against the unwritten rules. But a coalition of 5, 6, 7, 8 states, which is there, might. And this is why there is always a possibility that sanctions will be dropped sooner than we think. So Russia matters. Russia is important, and the willingness to re-establish a modus operandi which would basically mean, I'll come to that in the end, compartmentalization, selective cooperation with Russia, the search for that is going on. But the second set of reasons, and I don't need to elaborate on that, is linked with Ukraine. With Ukraine's, how shall I say, inability to deliver what it promised. Not only what was expected. I mean, obviously, this effect we also see, that expectations were too high. They were inflated, both in Europe and in the United States, everywhere in the West. But there are things which Ukraine promised. And it's not just something vague that we expect. Even what it promised, what it had to do in the context of visa liberalization. And what we see, frankly, is all sorts of tricks. When you pass a law about the declaration of civil servants' assets, but then you move the deadline of when this law enters into force by 1 year, which nobody expects. When you expect the president to finally fulfill his electoral promise of getting rid of his assets, and 2 years later, we keep the old story that this is being finalized. And this is being finalized in the way that the offshore companies are created to finalize this creation of the blind trust. I mean, this is too complicated for anybody. What we hear is, that's what I personally experienced. When you talk to the people there, they start telling you, please understand us, we have the war, therefore we are not going to do this and that. And I tell them, no, I don't understand. Because you signed this agreement, the DCFTA, when you had the war. You ratified it when you had the war. So it's not that you didn't know that you were having a war. And there are certain things that you have to do. Well, maybe certain deadlines can be, and they are flexible anyway, but maybe they can be moved. But a promise is a promise. A legal commitment is a legal commitment. If you don't want to do it, then enjoy yourself. And this is something that you know very well. I can only say that what I sense in Europe now is practically, it's still a little bit better at the moment, but it's almost what I felt in 2007, 2 years after the first Maidan. And when it was kind of, Ukraine was written off in 2007. Now it's not yet, but we are moving in that direction. And people are becoming more and more reluctant to give money to Ukraine. Again, you see it here. If you look at the IMF conditionality of the last 6 months, I mean, people are getting tougher and tougher, because otherwise it's clear that you will be paying the money and you will be just saying goodbye to this money. They will not be invested into a good cause. And the third set of reasons is linked to the processes which are going on inside Europe. Europe is not a well-functioning foreign policy organism or mechanism or a body. It's not. Europe is a horse trade. Europe is that you always bargain. I mean, I support you here today, you support me tomorrow there. And it's difficult. And this Europe, which has been, as I said, which has been experiencing a lot of problems in its foreign policy for many, many years, is now facing I'm a bit reluctant to use the word existential again, but maybe I'm very close to that. It's experiencing very, very serious, maybe existential challenges. Greece was a small thing, because as smart people say, if you can solve a problem with money only, then it's not a problem. And this is what was done. I mean Greece, okay, and it's not solved, but at least kind of, you know that in principle nothing wrong can happen for as long as you keep bailing out Greece. Now you have Brexit, and you don't even, I don't know what will be more problematic for the future of Europe, if the United Kingdom now quits or stays. Because if it stays on the basis of its very special conditions, and then it might request some new opt-outs, that might be the end of Europe, of the European project the way it's conceived, because the European project the way it's conceived is about more integration. And if you start creating all sorts of special statuses, you don't know where you will end up, because you will have to create a special status on human rights for Hungary sooner than you think. And if it leaves, I'm not sure Europe will know how to conduct foreign policy at all. You have the migrant crisis, and this crisis, again, first of all, it's very far from being even taken under control, because what we are reading now, I mean, you've got to deal with Turkey, you just got more people coming from Libya directly, the way they used to come a year ago and 2 years ago. Whereas Europe actually pushed the legal side of its operations up to the limit. I don't know if Europe can accept more migrants without being blown from inside, because I can tell you, I drive a car. I'm a crazy person. For my holidays, I drive to Spain, to Italy, all the way there, and I've been doing it for more than a decade. This year, I will have to pass 5 borders on my way back. And these are all now borders. I mean, my passport probably will not be checked, but I will still have to slow down. And there's a lot of panicking there. In the north of Europe, the Nordic Passport Union existed for more than 50 years. People were crossing the borders in the Nordic countries without the need to produce their passport for longer than 2 generations can remember. And now you have to have your passport traveling from Denmark into Sweden. Denmark into Sweden, of all places. So how does all this relate to here? Europe has other priorities. And frankly, the only person which has to negotiate on all that is German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The only candidate to be Europe's leader is her, and she's a human being. And if she has to deal with Britain, migrants, you name it, and then still go every once in a while to see Mr. Putin and talk Ukraine, maybe Ukraine will not be a priority. And this creates a willingness to basically do something, find a compromise, freeze, and forget. And this is what's actually happening. What I see is 3 things, very quickly. One is something that I've mentioned already. The consensus is de facto broken. Because yes, the official diplomatic mantra is Minsk or nothing. No. In reality, the German Vice Chancellor said many times that it cannot be Minsk versus the sanctions, but it has to be progress for progress. Partial lifting in exchange for progress. He said it officially, and then he came to Moscow, and then he said a number of things which were incomprehensible. That the current page in German-Russian relations has to be turned, that he doesn't understand how we got there, and this is his domestic politics. And it was not endorsed by Merkel, but he said that. The head of the Merkel's sister party, the Bavarian Christian Socialist Union, travels to Moscow more frequently than I travel to Moscow. Same things. Matteo Renzi, Italian Prime Minister, on the record, sanctions are a wrong thing, have to be discussed. But discussed means he's in favor of lifting. Austrian president, or was it chancellor, who said his country is interested in lifting. You have Hungary, you have Slovakia. I don't need to mention Greece and Cyprus. Basically, there is no consensus. Even at the top official, Sarkozy, I mean, he's of course not a president, but who knows, maybe he will be a president. You name it. So a very significant number of people speak in favor of compromise and easing the sanctions. You also see that European diplomacy, the practical work of especially German and French diplomacy, which are key in the whole process of implementing Minsk, has been nudged in the direction of what I call in the memo keeping the appearances. You pretend that you solve the conflict. You want to proclaim the mission accomplished. And this is what they have been doing. Pressuring Poroshenko to make sure Ukraine would pass constitutional amendments, which probably only Moscow needs, which were a non-starter. Pretending, now it has stopped, but pretending that the ceasefire holds. I mean, and this is the line which even the Ukrainian diplomacy likes to pick up partially. They, of course, they do not say that ceasefire holds, but they say that the situation is much better than a year ago, which is correct. But I think this is something which Europeans like to hear. In reality, it's not. I mean, the UN data for September were 8,000 people dead. For December, 9,000 people dead. Now everybody operates with 10,000 people dead. And I have data for the military. 563 Ukrainian military died in the conflict between March and December. So 10 months. I mean, it doesn't look to me as a holding ceasefire. But the diplomats want to phrase it this way. Because they want to show that the process is moving on, and the only thing which is missing is this indeed constitutional arrangement, elections. I heard even stories about plans like to pretend that Ukraine has received or would have received after the elections the control over the control over the Russian-Ukrainian border, because they would raise Ukrainian flags, even though people who would physically control the border would still be the local militias. But it would look nice. And this was done very persistently for many, many months. So the work to create the special status for the certain regions, areas of Donbass, because, and this is clear, there's clear political motivation and political tasking has been done this way. And you have the general discourse once again about the parameters of the compromise, the crazy word Finlandization of Ukraine. And as somebody who lives in Finland, I can tell you that this is the best way to insult two countries at the same time. And because basically people who are talking about it do not understand what they're talking about. In all seriousness, maybe they should be just speaking about military non-alignment. This is okay, but Finland was not an in-between country for many, many years, even when it had the Finlandized status, because it was involved into Nordic cooperation. It was progressively becoming a part of the West, if we're talking about the period after, not even 75, not even Helsinki, but 72, the European Free Trade Association. But okay, they're talking about Finlandization. They're talking about the establishment of the formal relationship between the Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union. That proposal has been tabled officially. NATO-Russia relaunching of the NATO-Russia Council, and they're looking for all sorts of statuses. So there is a certain dynamism of that. So I'm concluding where we are and where we go probably. EU is at a loss because obviously nobody wants just to make a deal with Russia at the expense of Ukraine. This is, well, not nobody, some people would be willing, but it's not politically plausible or palatable. EU comes up with a very interesting wish list. They're putting together things which cannot be put together. They call it compartmentalization, kind of we're friends from 9 to 12 and we're enemies from 12 to 3. And then again, the last word on that was published a couple of weeks back. The EU came up with 5 points, 5 principles of its relationship with Russia. Number 1 is full implementation of Minsk. Number 2 is that Russia should not intervene into relations between EU and its eastern neighbors, and kind of the relations with Russia should not be damaging the relations between EU and its eastern neighbors. Number 3, that eastern neighbors should actually help the EU to have a more sustainable, to become more sustainable, especially in terms of energy. I mean, so far so good. I mean, this is where we stay firm. But then number 4 is the selective engagement with Russia, and number 5 is interaction with the Russian civil society. So basically, this is the last wisdom available. This is a utopia for the moment, but this is a sign that the search is going on. I think that for the moment, for the time being, EU will not be able to disaggregate, to separate its policy on Ukraine and its policy on Russia, but I think this is what they want. This is what they would ideally want, to still punish Russia for something that Russia has done, and after Russia would have paid the price to make a new deal, and still have good relationship with Ukraine and see Ukraine transforming. But this is an idealist view which cannot be translated into real policy. But if they keep doing it and keep going the same way, probably Europe will get a lose-lose outcome. They will still not fix the relations with Russia, because Russian-European relations are very problematic regardless of Ukraine, and have been. And I've been lecturing on these issues for 10 years. I mean, the list of problems was getting longer and thicker. And the last thing which, in the bilateral context, EU and Russia were able to resolve was the visa liberalization agreement, not a visa freedom, but a visa liberalization agreement, which was initialed in 2005 and entered into force in 2007. Within almost a decade, on the bilateral track, there was nothing, because the Partnership for Modernization was a declaration which was not even supposed to work, and Russian WTO accession happened. It was supported by the EU, but it's not something that the EU can say was the achievement of the EU or a breakthrough in the EU-Russian relations as such. So 10 years of negotiations, very little was produced even before Ukraine, and that will all stay. Economic motivation for now is going down because Russian economic crisis objectively draws attention away from Russia, and the trust has been destroyed. I mean, you can forget about Ukraine maybe for a moment, but still, I mean, public opinion will remember what has been going on, and the leadership will, at all levels. And if you cheat your partner once, you should not expect trust to reappear next day or even next morning. So if you forget about Ukraine, you're not going to gain much in relationship with Russia. And if you keep doing what you're doing, meaning pressurizing Ukraine to prioritize this quasi-solution of the conflict over its own reforms, because you have to make choices, you will also lose Ukraine, because Ukraine, especially Ukrainian state will remain unreformed, essentially dysfunctional, and it will be just a drain on your resources. Somebody has to explain this to the Europeans, but I think for me, and probably for the friends of Ukraine, it would be much more important to explain it to the Ukrainians and to the Ukrainian leadership, that they cannot really influence European decision-making as concerns Russia that much, because, I mean, they are a factor, but they don't have anything decisive here. But they have to show and convince the Europeans that they can deliver. If they don't, it's not the Russian sanctions, whether they will be lifted or not. It's a relatively minor thing. The big thing is the general economic support, technical support that Ukraine might need, and if it doesn't deliver soon, that will be over, and then we will be waiting for another Maidan, and I don't know when that will happen, and the cycle will start all over. I stop here.
Great. Thank you very much. Terrific set of remarks. We have plenty of time for questions. Please, if you could briefly identify yourself.
I'm a co-director and business scholar here, and I'm from Ukraine, so I can use the role of discussing, but I wouldn't. I have a couple of questions to make remarks. First of all, you perfectly elucidated all the reasons why the EU has problem with extension of sanctions, but I think you missed one aspect which is, or should be important, maybe it's not, but should be important, aspect of so-called common values. Yeah, European Union positions itself as a community of values. And since Russia violated all possible principles and norms and so on, obviously she deserves some sanctions. So, this axiological aspect, I believe it should be very important because it's how European Union is built upon. Secondly, I feel that, not you but specifically, but generally Western analysts tend to fuse Ukraine state and Ukraine society, which is probably natural for Western people because they have representative governments and so on. Ukraine has not really a representative government, it's not quite representative. And the difference is increasingly big. This gap between state apparatus, political elite, and society is growing. Elite reproduces itself. Since independence, they are more or less the same people, or same type of the people. Society is gradually, slowly but steadily evolves, becomes more and more mature, and this gap results in one revolution, second revolution, and probably next revolution would be there. Maybe there is no critical mass within society to change this elite completely, but still my feeling is that it's growing. It's growing in strength and in number. And finally, the issue which was not mentioned here, but which is increasingly important, I mean situation with Crimean Tatars. Because I believe that what is happening now to Crimean Tatars, only this development requires very strong sanctions. Because they are virtually erased from peninsula. People who are natives of the peninsula, who are the only legitimate owners of this peninsula, now they are persecuted, their businesses are destroyed, their schools, media are shut down, and their activists are brought to court, charged under some, fantastic accusations, or just kidnapped. There are more and more cases when Crimean Tatars activists are simply kidnapped by some paramilitary guys and disappear. So this is really dreadful development which is absolutely absent here in mass media and everywhere.
3 parts to that. Go ahead.
I agree with everything, but it's just the world or Europe today doesn't work like that. I mean, on values, I said it myself in my publications many times that the EU should behave as a value-based actor. In reality, it doesn't. I mean, it's sad, but it doesn't. I mean, that's been the case as regards Russia for many, many years. But we have the most recent, I don't have a word, but a terrible example, which is Lukashenko. Lukashenko is now EU's best friend. Nothing changed in Belarus's domestic politics, just nothing. He is humiliating all these EU wishful thinkers who expect the changes. He basically said, yeah, I'm going to have parliamentary elections in the fall, but what did he say exactly? Kind of, we don't have the money anyway. That's so. But the idea, nobody expects that the opposition will get there. They will participate, but the results will. The repressions go on. He keeps saying that he's not even going to abandon the alliance with Russia or even rebalance his foreign policy. I don't know how long it will take for one of the EU countries, I would expect Slovenia, to start with, to arrange a state visit of Mr. Lukashenko. He has not done anything. I mean, we remember the articles of Radek Sikorsky and of December 2010, Lukashenko, the loser. He has not done anything, and EU has done everything. So, if we think of a signal that has been just sent to Moscow, this is it. If you do not make concessions, we will. This is the pattern of behavior. So the values, I'm afraid, do not play a major role, let alone the fact for how many years EU embraced the worst dictators in its southern neighborhood, and to a certain extent continues doing that. And the last deals with Turkey on the migrants, it's moving in the same direction. And anyway, so it's not that I disagree, but it's that in reality it's different. Again, the civil society is changing, but the civil society cannot compensate for the absence of state. I mean, maybe in historical perspective, there will be changes. I mean, and they are. Of course, if we, for those of us who you live there and have been watching Ukraine for 25 years, of course there are changes. I mean, it is a different country. But from the point of view of the Western policymakers, funders, just usual businesses. I mean, I was at the presentation yesterday at the Atlantic Council of the report on Ukraine's energy security, and the person who represented their real business, I mean, he was really careful about what he was saying, but the message was clear. I mean, I want to invest in Ukraine, but I want to get my licenses easily. And you know, so the point is that I don't know how much time, in historic terms, Ukraine has, whether there will be another chance for breakthrough. And again, I liked Grigory Yavlinsky once said that, you know, the difference between developing countries and developed countries is that actually developing countries never become developed. I mean, you don't have to accept it, but the point is that or I can give you another thing. What Lech Walesa once said. He said, Poland is moving in the right direction, but we are riding a bicycle and everybody is going in their Mercedeses. And that might be another kind of way to look at it. The state has to change. And the people who represent Ukraine, the Ukrainian elites have to understand that maybe they will not get another chance. I mean, if they ruin their chance now, the next one will not necessarily come. I mean, anyway, I don't want to. And the Tatars, I think this is a right issue. I don't know how all this will play. I think before September last year and before the blockade, nobody seriously thought about that. But I would say that nobody seriously thought about that inside Ukraine either. Well, not nobody, but again, the government which was supposed to do certain things, that government, or people acting on behalf of that government, was signing agreements about delivery of electricity towards the Crimean Federal District of Russia. And I don't know what kind of mentality these people had, but money matters, and money mattered, and now this is becoming an issue. I know about interest in the European Parliament, the studies that are being done about the actual situation of the Crimean Tatars. But having said that, I'm still very far from thinking that we could have the next round of sanctions be centered around the rights of the Crimean Tatars. It's now Minsk, and it's now Minsk or nothing, and I believe it may be a different Minsk or nothing, Minsk 3, but I'm not sure we are coming to that. I'm not sure even It's not like the issue of the Jewish immigration in the 70s, for instance. I mean, the parallel is loose, but we are not going anywhere there. It will be discussed in the general complex of, human rights, but I don't think that the Russian Western or Russian European conflict will be centered around this issue.
Hi, Nicole Gowett, I'm with CNN. Thank you for this talk. My apologies if you addressed this at the top, but I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about the policy prescriptions you think the U.S. should be following vis-a-vis Ukraine, given the situation. This administration and the next.
I can collect some more questions while you think about it.
Sufyan Zhumukhov, George Washington University. I want to push you in the other direction, and let's imagine the best case scenario. Sanctions are lifted and Russia-EU relations become restored, etc. But there is one issue there, Crimea, and even the political forces who are in opposition to Kremlin admit, most of them, that it's impossible to return Crimea. So would it mean that Russian-Western relations will never restore?
Question?
Yeah, hi. Justin Tomchek, U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. Why is it that Germany and France continue to negotiate unilaterally with Russia instead of sending Federica Mogherini, the High Representative for Foreign Policy of the European Union?
Are those enough?
Yes. Now, policy recommendations. I mean, first of all, with due respect, I do not expect much from this administration. Because I think this administration has not been demonstrating the utmost willingness to be involved. It is involved, of course. I mean, it's a key actor, but from the formal point of view, I think that it would be better to have the US formally represented, to continue from where we were in April 2014, namely the Geneva format, where the US participated, as opposed to the Normandy format, where it is not. I cannot know why it is not formally present, but I believe that if it wanted, it would be present. And I think that it would be good. But if things going to change after the elections, I don't know. But probably if there is no major escalation of the crisis or conflict in the East, I don't expect them to change. So what I think the US could do is to increase its involvement in terms of conditionality. But basically, so the focus should be reforms in Ukraine and not a conflict.
Corruption?
Everything. I mean, Ukraine is on life support. Without the Western money, it cannot manage. And this is where you should show intolerance to lots of practices that are still going on in Ukraine. I understand that this is not such a simple thing, and of course, you don't want to look like a colonial administration, coming and telling the people what to do. But if this is for me, the key thing is that this is the Western taxpayers' money. Therefore, if this money is stolen, the cause of Ukraine will lose, because the support among the average people in the West will diminish. And therefore, maybe certain key things where the kind of key reforms which require the Western money, even the paychecks should be signed by people actually directly responsible to the Western taxpayers rather than to the Ukrainian citizen. I know I'm radical, and I know you cannot do it maybe nicely diplomatically, but something has to be done. Knowing about the level of corruption and knowing about the power of oligarchs in the country, you should be very careful with how you spend Western taxpayers' money. But as I said, the focus should be on the internal transformation of Ukraine. Because if Ukraine is internally transformed, it will be able to deal with the conflict in its east much better than it can now. I would not recommend necessarily now giving Ukraine new weapons. And again, I know that this used to be a sensitive debate in this country a year and a half ago, but I would be very careful for a number of reasons. But as it comes to, but while at the same time training the Ukrainian military and training them, that would be a good thing to continue. But when it comes to the conflict in the East as such, I think the US government, the Europeans should seriously think about a new diplomatic initiative, a big one, unbundling Minsk II, abandoning the formula that it's Minsk or nothing, because Minsk II or nothing means nothing, in all seriousness. And it's not going to be implemented. And actually offering the lifting of the sanctions in exchange, or easing of the sanctions, in exchange for a new deal which would be much more favorable for Ukraine as compared with the current agreement, which, at least on paper, is largely favorable to the separatists. And that's why it's not going to be implemented. I think this is what I would do. Focus on reform, not being afraid of the frozen or simmering conflict, because the conflict of the current intensity Ukraine can cope with. And being more involved diplomatically. But as I said, I do not necessarily see this happening. Maybe I just don't know. Maybe there was a meeting between Victoria Nuland and Mr. Surkov, which lasted, some people say, for 6 hours. We don't know what was the content of that meeting. Probably that was the waste of time for both. But I would like to know more what they were discussing. But so maybe we are moving already. Maybe I'm knocking on an open door. I don't know. Crimea, for all practical purposes, and I hate saying it, but this is a non-issue. It's gone. Russia says it's Russia's, and it's a non-negotiable. The West largely acquiesced to that in March 2014. As I said, the sanctions introduced after Crimea were meaningless. And I think this is where the sides tacitly know that it's going to be something like the attitude by the US towards the annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union in 1940. So we don't recognize it, but in reality it means nothing. And this is not an issue. That's why I think that without the war in Donbass, we would be talking about Crimea as the West would be talking about Crimea as an occupied territory and annexed rather than occupied. But in practice, it wouldn't mean anything, and there would be no sanctions. So, with Crimea annexed to Russia, the Western-Russian relations can still be business as usual, because that would still be considered as something one-off. This is where this debate that I was talking about, the population of that territory still wants to be part of Russia and be Russian citizens, and without the troops, the referendum would still have produced the results that they would want to join Russia and all that. I mean, you cannot test these propositions, and they were never tested. And you can argue that this was not necessarily, or would be not necessarily be the case. But now, I mean, this is quite serious. In principle, 20 years down the road, maybe Moscow would, under a different leadership, be inclined to have not a referendum, but some kind of a internationally recognized survey where people want to be part of Russia or whether they want to be part of Ukraine. But this is too speculative. But I'm convinced that if there is a deal on Donbass, the Crimean issue as such will not be a major obstacle for the normalization of relations. Why it's Germany and France and not the EU, I mean, I don't have the answer. But I think it just, partly because this is probably, it is still easier to make a deal with the leaders of other major European powers, assuming that they will be able to later sell this deal to the rest of the EU. And I think in practice it works better indeed. But I also think that it could also happen because 2014 was the year when the Commission was changing and the whole institutional setup inside the EU was changing. And during the time of Minsk I, was Mogherini already in office, I think, or she might have, but that was exactly that, the process which I cannot congratulate the EU with, because how those appointments of Mr. Tusk to be the chairman of the council and Madam Mogherini to be High Representative, how that deal was finalized, as I said, to me doesn't look good. Because this was exactly a deal. So you chose people, this is how it looked to an outside observer, because again, I can't know. But since it didn't even happen from the first go, they had to reattempt and renegotiate it. They gave something to the Southerners, they gave something to the Easterners, and they gave commission to Mr. Juncker. And anyway, so that didn't look good. And by the time of Minsk II, there was already a format. And I still think it, for all practical purposes, it works better. The only country which was unhappy about it, as far as I know, was Poland. Because Poland wanted to be in. They wanted to be at that table. And I think the current government is even less happy than the previous one. especially because they were part of the original deal between the opposition and the Yanukovych. And then, for some reason, they found themselves to be outside.
That deal didn't work out so well.
Which again tells you how much the EU actually knows, because the Russian representative did not sign it.
Yeah.
So Russia cannot be even held accountable for that.
Time for another round, Jeff?
Thank you, Jeff Goldstein from Open Society Foundations. To what extent do you think the debate within the EU over policy towards Russia, Ukraine, is corrosive of EU unity? You mentioned that Greece was solved by money, but it really wasn't, because it created this huge split between the rich and the poor, and now we're seeing all these others. So can you talk about what effect you think this has on the EU as an institution?
I'm Bill Marsteller with Export-Import Bank. You mentioned how important it is for Ukraine to deliver, and also how the focus should be on getting them to reform. And I think for people who have observed the economy for a number of years, that's been very frustrating. And in this instance, I can't tell you how many times I heard Putin has managed to actually unify Ukraine. This time it will really be different. They put good technocrats in the government, and they're really going to adhere to IMF conditionality and make these reforms go through. And again, they floundered. So I guess my question would be, how would you envision that they actually would deliver? At this point, I think, at least over the medium term, it's hard to imagine how that happens.
Karl Lankowski, Foreign Service Institute. At the risk of going off topic just a little, I wanted to press on your perceptions of what's going on in Russia and whether Russia deserves to have the same status as a negotiating partner as of any other normal state. So this is the Karen DeWisha question, of course. That is, we're dealing with a kleptocratic state, in her terminology, run by a criminal gang. And if the Panama Papers are showing us anything today, it's the reach of that state in, this goes back to the question that was just asked previously about, again, about Russia's effect on Europe. And I wonder whether part of that effect is the undermining of the rule of law institutions throughout the European Union itself. I have heard a news report of a meeting which may not be happening tomorrow on the day of the referendum in the Netherlands, bringing together people like Gerhard Schröder and the Deputy Chancellor of Germany to press forward with the Nord Stream 2 project, for instance, in this regard. I mean, what are we dealing with here?
Back to you.
Whether this debate is corrosive of the EU unity. It is, but I would not exaggerate it, because EU constantly debates things. I mean, this is why the EU policy is always a compromise. I mean, because I come from the family of medical doctors. That's why there's something inside of me which is against compromises, because I've been taught that, you need the right dosage. If you take half a pill and half of another pill, it's not going to work. You need one but full. And this is exactly how the EU works. I mean, that this is the greatest mechanism ever invented in history of settling down disputes in a peaceful way and negotiating. And this has been their strength for as long as they were dealing with the problems inside. And it became, or often becomes, their weakness when they start dealing with problems outside, but now also inside as well. So sometimes you've got to do a thing and not half of it. They never agree fully about everything, but in the end they always agree about something. This is the case. One of the examples. The way the sanctions are, as I said, procedurally introduced and imposed at the moment rather works for the unity, but it's not because everybody likes, but because everybody calculates the choices and vetoing the decisions, running against this reluctant consensus is not considered to be in any MS interest. I don't think they really have very bitter feelings against each other because they are in disagreement with Russia. In that sense, I think Greece was a bigger issue. It lasted longer. It's structurally serious. It's about your life inside Europe, and this is still a foreign policy issue, and which is not an existential threat. And after all, it's just Ukraine. If in the end, which I do not exclude, there is a coalition like 10 countries which finally comes to Berlin and says, enough is enough. And Germany has to give in. That might create problems. But for as long as it stays kind of where it is now, I don't think we need to blow it out of proportion. I'm frustrated myself. I mean, I'm still, as Mykola, I see the changes. I see the larger influence of, let's say, good people in the parliament. We finally can say that in this parliament, at least there is a group of people, and it's not a small group of people, who are not for sale. These people will not allow to be bought, regardless of how much you offer. This is a new thing in Ukraine. But they don't yet form a critical mass. It's an important constituency, but it's not all. Some of them, like the journalists who started the whole Maidan, like Mustafa Nayyem, they admit publicly that their own reputation actually suffered from having been members of the Ukrainian parliament. I mean, they say it now, which is important, because that means it's also the perception in the society. Because if we delegate somebody to the parliament as the representative of a civil society, and then we see that this person and we don't see a quick fix, we start thinking that these people also kind of lost reputation. So I don't have an answer. I mean, and I certainly, despite what I said earlier, do not want to create an impression that I believe that kind of if only the West wanted, if it twisted all the hands that you can find, there would have been a change. But you have to combine. You have to keep explaining people that certain things have to be done. You have to explain to the people, which is I think is important, because there is this thinking in Ukraine, in Kiev at least, that they are too big to fail. That from now on, whatever happens, the West will bail them out. The West will eventually, if Russia escalates militarily, the West will give them weapons. If Russia uses aircraft and missiles, the West will come and do something else against Russia. So there are these expectations in a way, and that kind of the West will always be permissive because they're so important. Maybe we should be explaining to them that this is a wrong impression, that there are also limits on this side. But kind of there is a combination of there is a constituency that is genuinely willing to see change. There is the majority of the population, I would say the majority of the population, which is either supportive or at least understands that things have to be done. I mean, everybody, when I was in Kiev last September, everybody was telling me that now that the people finally starts getting the real energy bills, there would be another Maidan. It didn't happen. And you don't even see it in the public opinion polls. Because of course people say, yeah, the hardship, it's difficult. We cannot continue like that for much longer. And then months after months after months, and they show this understanding. But the West could probably, in that sense, do more in trying to explain that no, this money flow is not unlimited, and they have to do things. I'm trying to be optimistic. It doesn't mean I am. I'm not sure that I really got the question. Well, first of all, it might be kleptocratic, but that's the regime that we have to deal with. That's the regime that conducts foreign policy on behalf of the Russian Federation. I must also say that this is a regime which conducts this foreign policy very efficiently and successfully. That's a regime which has been able to punch above its weight practically since day one. I mean, it was not making concessions. It was not bluffing. I mean, it conducts the foreign policy which we don't think is the right way to conduct foreign policy in the Europe of the 21st century. But it's also the West's problem, that the West, time after time, gets surprised and unprepared. Because, again, the people in Moscow, they've been very open about a number of things. When they say we will not let it happen, they mean it. And the West believes that it's enough. And that started from the NATO enlargement in the 90s and from Clinton. And I remember talking to people back then when I was saying, okay, what if something goes wrong? Yeah, we will tell them this is not against their interest. What if they don't believe? We will tell it again. And, well, but in the 90s Russia was weak and it had a different regime, so you could get away with it. With Putin you cannot. So, whether Putin has actually violated the promises that this regime had given to its international partners, I don't know. I mean, because again, I don't participate in the negotiations. For me, Debaltseva was the case. When something was promised on paper, even though I don't exclude, because somebody told me that the takeover of Debaltseva actually was a part of the deal. And I said, okay, and it was a Western person. I said, okay, if it was a part of the deal, then it's even worse. Because that means you were cheating. And, but maybe they were just naive or tired. And that was the case when probably still a lot of people expected something else than what actually happened. But other than that, I mean, Putin's foreign policy for many years was a foreign policy aimed at the deal with the West, not a confrontation with the West. Starting from the moment when Russia did not react when the US abrogated the ABM treaty, when it acquiesced to the NATO enlargement to include the Baltic states. But Moscow had a certain plan, basically consisting of 3 points. One, no democracy promotion inside Russia, and that it received. Because the policy of democracy promotion inside Russia was stopped around 2006 by both the US and the EU. Second, it was this zone of exclusive or privileged interests. That's where this is a draw, because, I wouldn't say, now it is a contested territory, but it didn't always look like that. Oh, and finally, it was about asset swap on the basis of the deal on other points. That was a policy aimed at at reaching a modus operandi at the expense of Russia's post-Soviet neighbors. It was not a policy of a conflict, and in that sense, I'm not saying it's individual people, and I said the trust has been now undermined. But I still think pragmatic deals can be made, and Moscow will respect them.
I think we should invite Arkady back for another lecture just on this subject alone. I've been listening to you and trying to decide whether I think if the Dutch citizenry were listening to your words, whether that would sway them towards or against Ukraine any further. I honestly don't know. But I do know if they were to listen to your talk, that I would at least hope that they would be inclined to take your advice, and if your advice is to support the agreement, that they would. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Arkady for a terrific discussion. And as he did point out, his memo on which the topic was based is online if you'd like to take a look at it again, in addition to a number of other memos by other members of our network on this subject and many others. Thank you.